Explain like I'm 5. Food safety and boiling food to kill bacteria. Why can't we indefinitely boil food and keep it good forever? My mom often makes a soup, keeps it in the fridge for over 10 days. It usually is left overnight on a turned-off stove or crock pot before the fridge, then boils it and eats it. She insists it's safe and has zero risk. I find it really gross because even if the bacteria are killed, they had to have made a lot of waste in the 10 to 15 days the soup sits and grows mold. Foul, right? But she insists it's normal, and I'm wrong. So can someone explain to me, someone with low biology knowledge, if it's safe or not, and why she shouldn't be doing this if she shouldn't? Every food safety guide implies you should throw soup out within 3 to 4 days to prevent getting ill. Edit? I didn't mean to be misleading with the words indefinitely either. I guess I should have used periodically boiling. She'll do it every few days, then leave it out with no heat for at least 12, but sometimes up to 48 before a quick reboil in fridge. To answer the question in your title, you in fact can boil a soup indefinitely to keep it food safe. This is known as a forever soup or perpetual stew. The longest on record appears to have lasted over 500 years, until it had to stop due to lack of resources from World War II. Yeah, but those are always kept above safe temp, no? His mom cooled the soup and then reheated it. I think there's a difference. But I really so like the idea of this communal soup pot being constantly refreshed in some medieval inn. Yeah, the title referenced indefinitely boiling food, which I took as different from boiling once and then refrigerating. It's my bad. I should have worded it a bit better. She basically takes it out every day, boils it, leaves it on the stove or crock pot for 24 to 48 hours, puts back in the fridge, then does it all over again for 10 to 15 days. So I meant more like, keep boiling every time you wanted some, and made it sound confusing. Sorry. Bacteria consume and produce waste. A lot of that waste cannot be neutralized by simply boiling. This is why we cannot take rotten meat or seafood and boil it to safely consume. Basically, eating too much bacteria poop makes you sick. Bacteria produce compounds that they excrete into their environment for many purposes, including to inhibit, kill other organisms. These compounds can make you very sick. Boiling the soup to kill the bacteria doesn't remove or destroy these compounds, so it can still make you sick. However, I forget the name for them, but there are endless stews. Basically, the stew is kept constantly at a temperature high enough. Bacteria and viruses cannot survive, and more ingredients are added as needed, so it essentially stays good forever. That was what I thought your title was asking about. Keeping soup in the fridge for 10 to 15 days and boiling it again has given microbes time to colonize the soup, and it could make you sick. That said, most things are fine to eat longer than people realize. If it smells and tastes okay, it's likely fine. Explain like I'm 5. How are we able to measure the half-life of uranium-238 if it's 4.5 billion years? Tried looking it up and it got complicated real quick. Short answer, it's always splitting and fissioning, but it's a question how fast it's happening. We can count the rate at which it splits naturally, and based on that, we can get an estimate of how long it would take for half a given sample to fission and spilt, which is 4.5 billion years. It's like being able to say, this person can walk at 4 miles an hour. Ergo, he would take 100 hours of non-stop walking to cover 400 miles. We are extrapolating based on known data. There are 2 types of people in the world. 1, those who can extrapolate from incomplete data sets. 2, and those who know it's 10 types of people, those who know binary and those who don't. One nice model to think about radioactive decay is to imaging having a massive bucket of dice. You roll the whole bucket and then remove any dice that landed on a 1, then collect all the dice back in the bucket and repeat. If you were rolling a bunch of standard 6-sided dice, then you'd expect 1/6 of them to roll a 1 on any given roll. After 1 roll, you have 5/6 of the original number of dice, 83%. After 2, you have 25/36, 69%. 3 rolls reduces this to 57%, and a 4th roll takes things to 48%. You could keep doing this over and over again, and the number of remaining dice would get lower and lower. Eventually, each die will roll a 1, but there's no guarantee of how long it'll take, and the more dice you start with, the more likely it is that one of the dice has a super long lucky streak. However, regardless of the number of dice you start out with, it'll always be about 4 rolls to have the number of dice remaining, at least on average. Statistical abnormalities are more common with smaller numbers of dice, but roll a bucket of 1 billion dice, and the results are likely to be pretty close to average. We could say that these 6-sided dice have a half-life of about 4 rolls, and we could even start describing things in terms of fractional rolls if we're not too afraid of logarithms. the actual half-life of D6 dice is about 3.80 rolls. By comparison, we might repeat the experiment with 20-sided dice. As before, only a 1 results in the die being removed. Here we see that after 1 roll, we still have 95% of the dice remaining. 10 rolls in, and we still have about 60% sticking around, and somewhere around 13 to 14 rolls, we finally hit the halfway point. Thus we see that a D20 has a much longer half-life than a D6. In both of these setups, we arrived at a half-life by looking at how many dice we returned to the bucket and kept going until the bucket was half as full as it started. However, suppose you start with a bucket with 1,000,000 dice inside, and you don't know how many sides they have. You roll them and find that 10 dice turned up with a 1. You don't have to put all the dice back into the bucket to have a good idea about how many sides these dice must have. It's probably about 100,000 to give 10 rolls of 1 out of 1,000,000 attempts. As soon as you know how many sides the dice have, it's just a matter of some arithmetic to find out how many rolls it would take to come down to half the original population. About 69,000 in this case. Here, it's a lot easier to count the 10 dice we removed than to count the 999,190 that we put back in the bucket. Turning back to radioactive half-lives, much of the same logic still applies. Of course, radioactive decay doesn't happen in discrete steps like the dice-throwing game, but it does follow similar probabilistic patterns. For some fast-decaying isotopes, it's sufficient to just start with a sample and wait until some of it has decayed. You could wait for half of it to be gone, or with a more precise scale, you could get away with letting just 1% decay or less. However, for a slowly decaying isotope like U-238, waiting for even 1% of a sample to decay is wildly impractical, so instead of tracking the dice in the bucket, we count the ones that were removed. This could take the form of putting a known quantity of the isotope into a position where we can count the decays. Even with a 4.5 billion year half-life, there will still be some decays. A billion atoms is nothing, and a billion billion is just starting to get into units that make sense at a macroscopic scale. That would be about half a milligram of U-238. In fact, this decay counting approach is only attractive for long-lived isotopes since the decays quickly get too numerous to count for something that decays faster. It's the duration until half of the sample decayed. You can measure the rate without having to wait the whole half-life. It's like the speed in your car. You don't need to wait an hour to know how many miles an hour you are driving. Explain like I'm 5. Why early American plantation owners preferred to import African slaves versus enslaving indigenous people. 2 reasons. The first is because of historical inertia. In the early Caribbean colonies, the planters did initially try to use the native peoples as labor, but the natives quickly began to die due to the introduction of European diseases and the conditions of labor. It became clear fairly quickly that another source of labor would need to be secured, so this is why they began importing African slaves. The life expectancy of slaves in the Caribbean was fairly short, given the disease-ridden conditions of growing sugarcane in the Caribbean at the time. So they needed to be importing more slaves constantly, which created a constant transatlantic slave trade. Once that was in place, the obvious choice for cheap labor for North American planters were African slaves, not Native Americans. The second reason is that indigenous people had a lot of options for escaping and going back to their own people. A lot of indigenous people were enslaved in North America at various times, but they often escaped. Tisquantum, one of the first indigenous people to contact the Pilgrims at Plymouth, was one such person. Africans didn't have that option and didn't know the land of North America, so it was thought that they would be easier to control. Wasn't sugarcane farming and processing in the Caribbean also just dangerous and hard as fuck and a significant contributor to mortality? I think it was both that and the reality that the sugar trade was wildly profitable. So the planters had little incentive to improve conditions for the workers because they could just afford to buy new slaves. There were a lot of factors, but I'll mention a couple of big ones. 1, disease had wiped out a huge number of the native population, making it difficult to rely on them as a labor force. 2, the remaining natives were spread out over huge areas, keenly aware of the land, and liable to band together in retaliation if numbers of them were taken by force. 3, Africans already had skills in agriculture, were accustomed to the hot climates of the Caribbean and American South, and carried more resistance to diseases the Europeans carried. 4, the transatlantic slave trade was already an established system with relatively cheap prices. A constant supply of human labor was already existent. If I kidnapped you, but didn't leave your neighborhood, you'd probably know how to get home if you escaped. Even worse, you probably have friends nearby who will help you kill me because they don't want to risk getting kidnapped. Well, that's another episode of Explain Like I'm 5 in the books. I really appreciate all of you who made it this far into the video. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, it would really help the channel out a lot if you gave the video a thumbs up, subscribe, or leave a comment down below. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.